So tonight the focus is on the spirituality of empire. I kind of realized after naming it that it'd probably been better to name it spirituality in the empire because in a way there's a very real sense in the way that I'm going to use the word spirituality that the empire doesn't really have one. And some of these words around spirituality, religion, empire are fluid, flexy words. And so in order to get into what I'm talking about and why, I have to unpack some of them. But first, as much as possible, I'm going to try to frame everything in terms of history and development so that we understand the moment we're in and that we understand that we're a part of a story and that none of these ideas are objective and etched in stone. Like words like empire, spirituality, empire, religion, they have many meanings that have changed over time, like sometimes within our lifetimes, and we maybe didn't even notice, right? So, I'm gonna start with a little bit of history here. Okay. We live in a world that has a bifurcated social reality. We take for granted things like separation of church and state or that politics and religion are separate things. And for a lot of us, we probably generally think it's a good idea because usually the religion that we're most familiar with, we don't really want influencing this stuff over here. But there's a lot of complexity that happens with this separation. And really, this history, which I'm going to go through, we didn't really have a category called religion until this happened. And so we think of religion as this thing. If I ask you what a religion is, you'll be like, well, a religion is a group of people that have a certain set of beliefs and practices about God. And so then we start listing different religions. Then you say, well, what about Buddhism? Certain forms of Buddhism don't have a God. Well, they still have beliefs and practices. And so we go through and we find a kind of system that we can put over everything that we call religion and say, it's a religion. If someone comes to us and says, and if you're a great Enlightenment or Western thinker, and someone comes to you and say, well, I don't think that fits. We don't really have that category. They're like, you're a religion. We just put everything in these sorts of categories. And there's a reason for that. During the Enlightenment, so Christendom, we know the history generally. Christendom was this social arrangement that we had pretty quickly after the time of Christianity, where Christianity was had this negative relationship with Rome. And all of a sudden they got buddy-buddy. Lots of people like to blame it on Constantine, that somehow Emperor Constantine came along and just co-opted Christianity and made it imperial. That's not exactly what happened. You had already, before Constantine came into power, a bunch of really wealthy bishops within Christendom, within Christianity, and their wealth gave them power. And even though they were only 10%, Christians were only 10% of the Roman Empire at the time, Constantine probably wisely saw that this is a great wealth and political grab to be buddy-buddy with this 10% minority faction, which is still pretty big, that was already growing in its wealth and power, and then scoop them in. So it's not as though there's all these suffering, martyred, pure, pacifist, great Christians that have all the radical values, and then Constantine corrupted it. We were already corrupting ourselves pretty well before that. So this fusion, beginning with the Roman Empire and then European civilization after that, we call Christendom, where the domain of Christianity and the domain of the post-Roman political world was the same domain. And it was all kind of thought of the same way. Maybe like the Pope didn't have political power over all of Europe, but he kind of did, right? There was this arrangement. They would never have separated. There was this competition between what kind of power the church had. But there's no confusion. The church definitely had power. It was just kind of an alliance. And so we get to the Reformation, which is this time when people started thinking, I don't like the kind of power the church has, because it keeps us from doing, from the Protestant perspective, it keeps us from doing church the way we want, but also from the, like speaking from the kind of the time of Martin Luther, the German princes who were kind of ruling would have liked to have more power for themselves. And so this period of the Reformation broke open this sort of two categories. So Luther talked about it as two kingdoms. This idea of two different spheres was already starting to be established, but it really cracked open with the Enlightenment. And here we have this idea that society, and this is a common idea among the Enlightenment thinkers, is like stages of development, right? Where you have a magical kind of thinking that's primitive, where people worship their ancestors and rocks and stuff. And then it matures and develops into full-on religion like Christianity. But then even that will give way to a society of pure reason, where we no longer have stupid superstitions. And then that idea of pure reason will develop a public sphere of politics, which we'll call secular. And this is the place where public life exists. Okay? And because we're not dicks about it, we're going to let you have religion, but it's going to be increasingly personal. And it's fine. It's great. So long as you don't bring that into this place where reason rules, right? So this need of bracketing off religion as this personal expression is what began the need to categorize this thing that is not this thing. Religion as a category in the West developed as a way of describing what's not this, so that we can maintain this. And so you have this, from the Enlightenment on, this flurry of thinkers, philosophers, later anthropologists, trying to define this concept of religion. And one of the more nuanced ones, because what ends up happening is they start realizing, usually in the 1900s, they start realizing, you know, as we have this category of religion that we superimpose on everyone, I realize it kind of clips people's experience off because they don't conform. So like if you are an Enlightenment European and you go experience Hinduism for the first time, they wouldn't have fit your definition of religion, so you have to tweak and expand it. And so after a while they realized that this expanding category of religion never quite fit. So you end up with kind of the dominant, this is the dominant definition of religion that tends to work specifically within anthropology from Clifford Geertz, that religion is a system of symbols. Keep that word in your mind, symbols. And notice how abstract this sounds, because this is the way scholars, we have to talk, because we want to be broad in our definitions. System of symbols, which act to establish a which act to establish long-term moods and motivations. Moods and motivations, right? And wrap them in a sense of factuality, so that these moods and motivations make sense of reality. Okay? That is an incredibly broad. I think it's meaningful if you think about it. Moods, the feels, motivations, how I do stuff and why. And that religion is a set of establishing that and putting that over reality. But that applies to lots of things. And so this is the problem of defining religion. You have Durkheim says that religion is a system of beliefs and practices related to sacred things. Also a good functional definition. Beliefs and practice, sacred things, except for when you start figuring out what's a sacred thing and what's not. because those are not easy terms. I've had conversations with atheist friends, because I tend to be one of these people who thinks that because these are so vague, you can get away with it, that religion, whatever we call it, is a fundamental aspect of humanity, and so belief in God isn't about religion. It's about related to sacred things, and you can pretty much put anything in there, so therefore everybody has religion. But if you're an atheist, that's an irritating as shit kind of way of defining, even if you can kind of vaguely grant there's something called the sacred. So it gets complicated. So we can't really find a complete word, or a complete and sound definition of the word religion, but as in a Western Enlightenment project, we can know what it isn't. And that's really all we have for what religion is that it's not this. Now, maybe that'd be great, but we don't really know what this is either, right? And like, if I'm going to be cutesy with the word sacred, the ideas of liberty, fraternity, equality, which was kind of the French Revolution ideas, are sacred ideas. And then the United States, which isn't, we all know isn't really that sacred, or, well, that's true too, but that's secular. Maybe in Europe, secular means something more, but in the United States, we don't really have a strong feeling of secular. So there's just something going on definitionally, and from a political standpoint, if we take a step back and look at how these function, you start to begin, there's a little bit of a deception that's going on. And most of us in the West aren't trained to see it. And this is where we get insights from scholars from outside the West. Talal Asad is a Muslim professor of religious studies, anthropologist. And from the Muslim perspective, traditionally, this split didn't quite happen. And so he notices that whenever there's this move towards the secular, it's to conceal things. That politics, the secular world, isn't just a new kind of religion exactly, but it tries to redraw the map as a way of saying whatever happens over here, we're going to do is reasonable. And this is the stuff that happens that's purely superstitious. Therefore, whatever we do over here, if as long as it makes sense to us, isn't superstitious. But then Talal Asad would say, there's a whole bunch of superstitions and irrational beliefs that dominate how we think about politics. But we can't see it or name it as such because we've already bracketed this off as the non-religion space. Okay, and it gets more complicated. So we saw this already that this definitional space that we give for religion is small. And as the idea of the secular project, whether it's happened or not, the assumption is that this space is supposed to get bigger and this is supposed to get smaller because as more developed human beings drop the foolishness of religion, it'll eventually atrophy and die. Because after all, we know the development. We all learned this sort of stuff in school. Primitive people who worship rocks and ancestors, to religion, to pure rationality. And so this will fall away. We know that really hasn't happened. But along the way, as this space gained more power, people within this space once again started making alliances to try to hold on to their social space, to hold on to their power. And this begins to explain the social moment we're in within evangelicalism. Think about it. So I grew up evangelical, and it used to mean a lot of things, and it means less things now. Because this space is smaller, and in order to engage and maintain power, you have to yield some of the ground here and form an alliance. And so here's a great example, and this isn't a dig on Mormonism. It's just a reality that happened with evangelicals. It used to always be, like if you go to Northwestern University now, Northwestern College, they have a cults class that everyone had to take. And so Mormonism was listed as a cult, right? It's bad. And there might be reasons why you don't like Mormonism. But it's interesting what things made it into cult and what things didn't. Catholicism was in their cult list too. Now, over time, when it became politically advantageous, the relationship between evangelicals and Catholics, they're like, oh, you're going to hell, started kind of getting softer because there was a political alliance over being pro-life. And so at Northwestern, Catholicism was dropped as in their list of cults, right? And then we had this thing that happened. Remember when Mitt Romney ran for president? And all of a sudden, evangelicals woke up in a world where maybe Mormons weren't so bad. Now, if it was driven by some sort of ecumenical spirit of love, that would be a great move. But what it wasn't being motivated by that. It was motivated by this sphere and maintaining power. So we have this other social phenomenon that happens. Again, there are great counterexamples to this. This is a generalization that we've noticed that as religion in the West, European West anyways, has declined and gotten smaller, it has gotten a little bit more inward, okay? Because it's losing ground and it gets anxious. So I don't want to get into the politics of seminaries, but we see this with seminaries all the time where seminaries do strange, irrational things that don't serve their constituents, but serve the maintaining of their stuff, right? It just happens. All institutions fundamentally function that way because, and I'll get to this later, an institution is a social grouping of managed humanity that fears death more than it fears like trouncing on the humanity within it. So an institution will almost always be vampiric rather than let itself die for its mission. This is almost a definition that you can have of an institution. And that's why movements always have to challenge institutions to not do that kind of crap, right? So as they go inward and atrophy, you have a bunch of people who still have a desire for spirituality because this is an innate human capacity, I think. And they can't find it here. So then you have this new thing that comes off that we call spirituality. I'm running out of space. I'm going to drop on the side here. Now, it's not like the word spirituality or the word religion were new. So back in the day, if you were religious, it meant you were part of a religious order. Secular meant that you were a priest that wasn't a part of a particular religious order. So there's older meanings to the words. Religion is understood to come from the word religare, which means to be bound. So a group of people that are bound to a set of practices. But that's a word that was used kind of within the Christian tradition. And so then it got appropriated and used for the larger thing. Same with spirituality. Spirituality within the Christian tradition means relating to the movement or activity of the Holy Spirit. So Christian spirituality is about Christian mysticism generally. How do you experience the Spirit of God? But as a broader category, this move happens where spirituality is a kind of almost seen as an individual experience of the divine or of things that are larger than humanity that are not bound by religion. Okay? It's freed from these narrow confines, and in a way, is a way for people to bring spirituality back into the public space, because now it isn't bound to a community, it's bound to an individual, and it goes with you wherever you go. Okay? Now, there's some negative and positive things about this move. Negatively, once we have this continued development of spirituality, which is in some ways a smaller space than religion, but it's more mobile, we have an increased marginalization of any kind of religious thing within the public sphere. Now, that could be good or bad depending on your perspective. Generally, it's good when you think of I don't want crappy religions influencing this. But I always feel this a little bit inside whenever I see clergy folks, which I'm a clergy folk, trying to reenact the civil rights as though ministers going to the streets has the same social capital or power that it had in the 60s or 50s, and it just doesn't. So in that context, it'd be good to have some more of that kind of religious space if it's to challenge oppression, but it doesn't work that way anymore, so it's further marginalized. Spirituality as a movement societally tends to be more uprooted. I'm going to be using the metaphor of uprootedness a lot during our time together. And basically what that means is when we become detached from a particular place and a particular people. Now, if you're running from that place or people, that's a good thing. If you're like from that crappy town in the movie Footloose, right, where you couldn't sing or dance, how many of you have seen the movie Footloose? You know what I'm talking about? Vaguely aware. Where it's kind of a cloying, destructive, oppressive experience. Being able to not be rooted in that place with those practices is great. But if your experience of being rooted in place with a community is good, this move is a sad thing. Because now there's no longer structures and roots to anchor yourself in, and so you're uprooted. Another negative thing about this is that spirituality is a bit vampiric, and I'm going to explain that. This is drawing off of the work of Talal Asad again, and Richard Horsley. Notices that we have this strange phenomenon that happened in the West with the development of these categories of religion and spirituality, where you have Western folks who feel spiritually malnourished, going to the ends of the world to non-Western spiritual traditions, using their categories to distill what they think the core of Buddhism is, as you see this a lot, or Native American spiritualities, or whatever, Taoism, all these spiritualities, distilling it, taking it with them and saying, I'm about that. And then because of how capitalism works, it gets sold back to people. And so there's actually American form Buddhism in traditional Buddhist societies. And that you might see that as good, but if you're concerned about how capitalism and things uproot, it's kind of not a great, there's some downsides to that. Okay? And this, another, Edward Said talks about this idea of Orientalism. This is an Orientalist sort of thing where we feel as though there's something exotic and wonderful about non-Western things. And out of our joy for the shiny thing, we treat it with disrespect and rip it out of its context. But there are some positive things about this move as well. One of the positives that happens as we shift away from this traditional arrangement towards spirituality is we begin to recognize some of the ineffective, ineffectual, beholden practices of many of our religious institutions. And as we leave, there becomes an opportunity to reroot in something else. Okay? Also, fascinatingly, and I feel like this is one of those things, like if I were a Pentecostal evangelical again, I would see this as how like the devil's plans were turned to good, because you have this clear trajectory of religion becoming increasingly individualistic, and there's almost this assumption from the Western tradition of being disembodied. There's like this assumed substance dualism. So we have in kind of earlier Christian and Hebraic tradition of the sacred versus the profane, gets misunderstood to be a substance dualism. And so then you think of, it's easy, and early on, spirituality was all about the interior and yielded more of the external to the world of politics. But what ended up happening is spirituality has become increasingly more concerned with holism than most religious traditions have been. Part of it is this kind of vampiric hunger, like I feel like I want to be a holistic being, and maybe I'll dabble in practices I don't understand to get to it. But the positive of that is I'm dabbling in holistic expressions because I realize I need something more. And that can lead back around to a re-engagement with the political sphere with potentially more power than we had under some of our collapsing religious institutions. And I'm going to conclude a thought, and then we're going to take a little break. Going back to Talal Assad, the interesting thing, though, from the perspective of imperialism, is paying attention to how this whole thing is framed to conceal superstitions and assumptions that are not rational.
Where is the Reformation sort of taking place in that? I knew you don't want quite that much detail. But
Yeah. I mean, the Reformation is here, and it created the condition. I don't know if we could have had an Enlightenment without the Reformation.
Sure.
Maybe there had been something else like that happened. It happened here and gave all the ingredients for this. You know, it's always a fascinating conversation talking with, of course, conservative Catholic scholars have a way of talking about this that I don't like, but it's the progressive or radical ones that are fascinating because they recognize, it made sense why you guys did what you did. But you got to notice that this thing over here is kind of nasty. So there's a reason why within Western Christianity, things like liberation theology, not exclusively, but grew up among people who still had a political imagination. Whereas if you're Protestant, we've had to fight hard to get a political imagination back. So even the idea, the category of political theology is kind of a new discipline. And I think it's a corrective, or public theology. Other ways of spinning the same thing is a new way of realizing our theological tradition cut us off from this.
I think what's interesting about the Enlightenment is it kind of created this I think a lot of people disembodied themselves from certain practices that were tied to maybe like ancestral lineage that had a lot of deep wisdom. And then it became all about reason and all about intellect and head. And then you see people coming back to spirituality, wanting that experience again, but not knowing how to reconnect, with themselves and their bodies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're going to be looking at some of those same phenomenon from different angles. But it's fascinating. Like, one of the people we're going to be engaging is Simone Weil, who this house is named after. And she has so many great one-liners, but one of her one-liners is that the uprooted uproot people wherever they go. And so there is a real sense in which our own Western project uprooted us, and so then we started inflicting people unwittingly with a similar sort of toxicity, but it's worse because it came under the guise of conquest and colonization. But this disregard, like this separation of spiritual from physical, which had been simmering, it became nasty, especially the more when we start categorizing things like the development of whiteness is a part of that story of where that's even a continued violent uprooting for white people from their sense of who they are, because the white, what is that? That's not, there's no geographical location for whiteness. It's a universalizing sort of category. So this move towards abstraction, and again, it's fascinating how like we think the abstraction's over here and that somehow this is grounded, but this is like a deception to keep us from realizing how uprooting this is. Anyways.
I was just going to ask Mark, it was interesting because you talked about that, that move from sort of primitive to the, I forget what was the thing that came after.
It's magic, religion, and then reason. Yeah.
Well, and I was just thinking of like some of the work of Jim Perkins and I forget the guy down in New Mexico that you spent some time with, that has done sort of this idea of that the hunter-gatherer societies actually carry this sort of deep wisdom of the wilderness that we've lost.
Yeah.
And I know that your 2-year certificate program So
Yeah.
it's an interesting piece. I was just thinking about that as you talked about that, that trajectory, that there's sort of this move back to the pre-religious time, that there's ancient wisdom there that we've lost. And I don't know, that just came to my mind as you were talking about that. It's kind of interesting.
It is, and it's messy as hell. So like that group, which I'm not going to name, people re-engaging like in indigenous wisdom, if they're not indigenous, is fraught. And so you have like white people doing sweat lodges, and it's like, and that's a whole controversial big can of worms. But the thing is, like, and because of this separation, we want to borrow from you, even though we still have political power over you, is this this thing where it's like it ends up just uprooting more. And our desire, we're like hungry, zombies wanting to consume, and wherever we go that we find nourishment, we just rip it out of the ground. Jack Forbes wrote a book called Columbus and Other Cannibals. He's talking about the Wendigo spirit that afflicts white people. That's another way of talking about the same kind of dynamic. And so even this sort of like return to the land, wilderness stuff, we need it, but at the same time, if we do it, there's most ways that white people will do it are going to be violent. So we kind of painted ourselves in an existential corner. Yeah, Lena.
I don't know, you use the term political imagination.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, can you just flesh that out a little bit? Because it just struck me as, I don't have a great idea of it, I don't think. But
I think when I threw out that term, what I had in mind, I wasn't using it in any formal way, but I think because of the way many of us are conditioned in our society, we take for granted how we engage in politics as though we're just like, it's all natural and we have no agency. And so we just show up when they tell us to and do our thing because they tell us to. And then we say, I did my part. And so this is where it gets fascinating. Like, so there's all kinds of issues with anarchism, but like my earlier anarchist conversations with people that were excited about voting, which I'm a voter now, but I had this time where I was no, I'm not going to vote because it encourages them. So I had that, but I'd have these conversations, and one of the beneficial things about that season of my development was how many people that really just believed their only political engagement meant voting.
yeah.
And so that's not a political imagination, because I have friends who just think, who are in every other way kind of progressive or maybe even radical, who use the word politics as a purely negative word, and they think it means this separated sphere, and that if we're going to be radical Jesus-y people, we got to build this other kingdom over here, and it has nothing to do with this. And so that's, again, the same sort of loss of a political imagination. But then in this move, like with the people that are like, it's usually people really influenced by a certain kind of Anabaptism or anarchism. They have this whole way of seeing things where they assume they see suffering and they want to respond, so they try to create some sort of counter project that lacks any real capacity to deal with anything. So a conservative version of this, I think, has some beautiful insights in it, is that, well, the government shouldn't be caring for poor people, it should be the church. Now there's could be great things in that. It just so happens the church does a crap job at caring for poor people. But again, it's this sort of lack of being able to understand what this even is. What does it mean to live in this space? Or we assume it just means I'm an American, as though that's a political identity and it's the only one we have.